أهلا بيكم. Today we're going to talk about the superior mediastinum. So let's start. We're done with the anterior and middle mediastinum. So next lecture will be about the posterior mediastinum, and today is the superior mediastinum. The superior mediastinum, as you can see here in this specimen, see, this is the part, the superior mediastinum. It's bounded below by a plane passing through the angle of Lewis, which is the second costal cartilage level, and back to disc between T4 and T5. And the superior boundary is bounded by a plane passing through the suprasternal notch or the jugular notch and the first thoracic vertebra. So we are talking about this area. Although it's not a big area behind the sternum and in front of the upper vertebrae, but it has many structures impacted in it, and we are going to study all the structures inside. Okay. Of course, it's laterally bounded by the mediastinal pleura. Structures found in the superior mediastinum: we have the thymus gland, the right and left brachiocephalic veins, the left superior intercostal vein, superior vena cava, arch of aorta and branches, trachea, esophagus, phrenic nerves, vagus nerves, left recurrent laryngeal nerve, thoracic duct, and lymphatics. See, many structures are impacted in this area. Okay. The thymus gland, here you can see the thymus gland. Of course, it's functional in childhood and atrophies with age, and with old age, it will be replaced by just connective tissue. It can extend up to the thyroid gland, and it extends actually downwards in the anterior mediastinum, and we mentioned this when we studied the anterior mediastinum. Of course, the thymus is a source of T cells that forms antibodies against different infections in childhood and remains throughout life. And but the gland itself diminishes in size and atrophies with age. This is the thymus gland. Don't confuse it with the thyroid gland, please. This happens. Thymus gland. Okay. The right and left brachiocephalic veins. The right brachiocephalic vein, of course, we know the brachiocephalic vein. Each brachiocephalic vein is formed by the union of the internal jugular and the subclavian vein, and both start behind the corresponding sternoclavicular joint. See that? Now, the right brachiocephalic vein descends almost vertical, and it's much shorter than the left one that has to cross all the superior mediastinum to join the right brachiocephalic vein to form the superior vena cava that's present on the right side. Okay, that's why the left brachiocephalic is longer than the right brachiocephalic vein. We said the right one formed behind the right sternoclavicular joint, and joined by the left one behind the first costal cartilage. So it has a short course actually. Tributaries include the vertebral veins, the internal thoracic veins, and the first posterior intercostal vein. Remember, the first posterior, or the highest or the supreme intercostal, that drains into the corresponding brachiocephalic vein before it's joined by the left brachiocephalic. Now, for the left brachiocephalic, slightly different story, because it's longer and has to cross the superior mediastinum, cross superficial all to all structures in the superior mediastinum. Actually, it's the first structure behind the thymus. So actually, if the thymus is atrophied, so actually it's the first structure behind the sternum, and represented by a line drawn from the left supraclavicular joint to the right first costal cartilage. This is the surface anatomy of the vein. In children or in infants, it's because of the small thoracic cage and all the structures inside, it's slightly above the level of the manubrium, so it's exposed in infants, not like the adults where all the organs and parts of the body have reached its adult size. Tributaries include the vertebral, like the right one, the first posterior intercostal, and the left superior intercostal. Remember the left superior intercostal. There is left and right, but the right drains into the azygos, and the left one that takes the posterior intercostal veins of the second, third, and fourth spaces, and runs on, remember that, runs on the left lateral surface of the arch of the aorta, and drains into the left brachiocephalic vein. Now, to additional tributaries than the right, we have the inferior thyroid veins. Recall that when we study the thyroid, that the right and left inferior thyroid veins drain into the left brachiocephalic because it's the longer one. It's the one that's crossing below the level of the thyroid, so it receives the inferior thyroid veins. It has thymic tributaries and the internal thoracic vein like the right one. Okay, the left superior intercostal vein, as we mentioned, it drains the second through the fourth spaces and pass on the left side of the arch of the aorta, superficial to vagus and deep to the phrenic nerve. Means the phrenic nerve is superficial to all and the vagus is deep to all. Okay, and drains into the left brachiocephalic vein. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a plate where the vein is shown, or in books you will find it, but because of the copyrights I cannot bring such pictures. Okay, the superior vena cava vertically descend from behind the right first costal cartilage till the third costal cartilage, where it ends or empties into the right atrium. The superior vena cava is almost vertical in course, and it has a short course, or only for two costal cartilages. Receives the azygos, the arch of the azygos, receives pericardial and mediastinal veins. And it's remember when you talked about the shadow, the cardiac shadow in plain x-rays, it is part of the right border in the cardiac shadow of the heart. It's the superior vena cava. Remember the superior vena cava, then the right atrium. Okay. The arch of aorta, it's a big artery, of course, arising from the left ventricle. The ascending thoracic aorta goes up and to the right, and then starts the arch of the aorta. The arch of the aorta starts level with the plane of the angle of Lewis, means the right second costal cartilage arches upwards, and then, but does not go beyond the manubrium, of course, arches behind the manubrium and comes back and continues at the descending thoracic aorta level, the same level, second costal cartilage, but this time on the left side. So this is the arch of the aorta. Remember the we're not talking about the ascending thoracic aorta, which has tributaries, the right and left coronaries. No, we're talking about the arch itself. It has three major branches. The brachiocephalic artery. There is only one brachiocephalic artery on the right side, and the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian artery. Um, okay. Uh, Sorry. All the branches are crossed by the left brachiocephalic vein, as we mentioned before. Okay, the brachiocephalic trunk. Um, Together with the left common carotid artery, at first they were anterior to trachea. Then they diverged laterally. The left common carotid to the left side and the brachiocephalic to the right side. The brachiocephalic will, maybe because of the space here, so the two major arteries, the common carotid and subclavian, did not arise on the right side, the same as the left side. Okay. There is no, not much of the arch of the aorta here at this side. It's all posterior and to the left. So they arise, the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery, they arise by a single trunk, which is the brachiocephalic trunk or brachiocephalic artery. Divides behind the right sternoclavicular joint to the common carotid and to the subclavian, the right sides, of course. And now, if the thyroidema arteries, remember the thyroidema arteries that supply the thyroid from below, if they did not arise from the arch of the aorta itself, it will arise from the brachiocephalic artery or brachiocephalic trunk. The left common carotid artery, as we said before, it was anterior to the trachea and then to the side of the trachea, ascends on the side of the trachea and gets, wrapped in the carotid sheath in the neck. And you know the story then that the common carotid divides into two terminal branches, the internal and external carotid arteries that we studied in details in the neck. The left subclavian artery arches to the left side, and it will go, remember, behind the left scalene anterior, and here behind the right scalene anterior, and it will end up by becoming the axillary artery, the major blood supply to the upper limb. Of course, we studied the branches of the subclavian artery while it was in the neck. Once it crossed the first strip, it changes its name. So the axillary artery starts from this point forwards in the upper limb. Remember, the subclavian artery was divided into three parts by the scalene anterior, into first part proximal to scalene, second part behind the scalene, and third part beyond the scalene. And we studied the branches of the first part and the second part. Okay, a single structure that you will find here only on the left side that connects either the pulmonary trunk or the left pulmonary artery, but most commonly the pulmonary trunk, to the arch of the aorta. It was the ductus arteriosus. This is intrauterine life. One of the changes that happens at birth is that this duct is closed and turns into a ligament later, and it may stay unclosed for 10 days or 14 days or so. If longer than this, doctors prescribe indomethacin to close it because of it has a characteristic machinery murmur for the patent ductus arteriosus case, but usually it closes. Of course, it's closed in all of us, and the left recurrent laryngeal nerve loops around it from lateral to medial. Branch of the vagus nerve loops around the ligamentum arteriosum from lateral to medial and ascends behind the aortic arch between the trachea and esophagus, the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Recall that the left recurrent laryngeal was much longer than the right one. Remember when we talked about the recurrent laryngeal nerve on the right side may get involved if a lesion in the root of the neck, actually, or in the neck most commonly. And the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, don't forget this information because it may get involved in tumors in this area between the aortic arch and the pulmonary arteries. Okay, so it may be involved in lower down levels. Don't skip this. Don't, always keep it in mind that hoarseness of voice may indicate something wrong in this area on the left side in the superior mediastinum. Okay, the trachea and esophagus. The trachea starts at the cricotracheal membrane, and then a series of incomplete C-shaped cartilages with membranes between them. This forms the trachea, and at the back it's closed by the trachealis muscle, responsible for the change of size or the constriction of the trachea. The trachea descends to the level in the superior mediastinum, anterior and to the right of the esophagus. Remember this, the esophagus is slightly shifted to the left because of the narrow space at the thoracic inlet, so it's slightly pushed to the left. Remember the direction that the esophagus goes to the stomach, which the stomach of course lying on the left side, so the esophagus is posterior and to left of the trachea, and they have the recurrent laryngeal nerve between them, either on the left side but from lower down, or on the right side from the beginning of the right recurrent laryngeal nerve at the level of the subclavian artery. Remember that it loops around the first part of the subclavian artery. And both trachea and esophagus are crossed laterally on the right side by the azygos vein and on the left side by the arch of the aorta. It divides into right and left main bronchi, level with of plane passing through the angle of Lewis to angle of Lewis. And into right and left main bronchi, and we talked about the difference between the right bronchus and the left bronchus, that the right one is more vertical and wider than the left, so foreign bodies tend to lodge into the right side, and the incidence of lung abscess is more on the right side, while the esophagus continues into the posterior mediastinum to finally pass through its opening in the diaphragm and ends in the cardia of the stomach. At the level of T11, the passes through diaphragm level of T10, descends for one vertebra in the abdomen, and ends in the cardia of the stomach, or by becoming the cardia of the stomach, because all the GIT was one tube, one continuous tube actually. Okay, for the vagus nerve, you know that it was in the carotid sheath before, and the right vagus nerve enters mediastinum between the right brachiocephalic vein and the brachiocephalic trunk. We said before that the vagus always tries to go medial to meet the other vagus on the esophagus as the esophageal plexus, and it passes immediately behind the root of the corresponding lung. So the right vagus behind the right root and the left vagus behind the left root, and on its way it gives branches to esophagus, of course, the cardiac plexus and pulmonary plexuses for the nerve supply of the heart and lung respectively. And we talked about these in the last lecture. Yes, in the last lecture we mentioned the cardiac plexuses. The left vagus nerve enters mediastinum posterior to the left brachiocephalic vein, between the left common carotid artery and the subclavian artery, descends on the lateral side of the arch of the aorta, but it's deeper than the phrenic nerve and deeper than the left superior intercostal vein. Left superior intercostal vein crossing it while on the arch of the aorta. And as it gives off its recurrent laryngeal nerve, see, this is the left vagus nerve, and this is the recurrent laryngeal nerve of it. Of course, the aorta here is displaced to show you the field, and this is the right vagus here, continuing down to meet over, as you can see, the esophageal plexus. They will form the esophageal plexus in the posterior mediastinum, and that will give rise to anterior and posterior vagal trunks. Both have mixed fibers from both vagi. Okay, it gives branches to the esophagus, the cardiac plexus, and pulmonary plexuses, and as we said, gives the left recurrent laryngeal branch lateral to the ligamentum arteriosum. Please remember this. So it curves around it from lateral to medial and ascends afterwards behind the arch of the aorta. Last thing to talk about in the superior mediastinum are the phrenic nerves. The right phrenic nerve, which is shown here, this is the right phrenic nerve, this is the right vagus. This is the left phrenic nerve, this is the left vagus. And if we were talking about the vagus, that it always tries to go medial to meet its the other side vagus. No, the phrenics always try to go lateral. So they surround, actually, they go on the lateral surfaces of the pericardium, embedded in the wall of the fibrous pericardium and supplying it, and ends by piercing the diaphragm. The right phrenic nerve enters lateral to right vagus and right brachiocephalic vein, descends along the brachiocephalic vein and superior vena cava, and then the pericardium, anterior to the roots of lung. You will be always asked about this. The vagus posterior to the root, and the phrenic anterior to the root of lung, and it's always accompanied by a branch from the internal thoracic, which is the pericardiaco-phrenic vessels, pericardiaco-phrenic artery and vein, coming from the internal thoracic artery and going back to internal thoracic vein. Now, the right phrenic will go through the vena caval opening, inferior vena caval opening, in the diaphragm, in the central tendon of the diaphragm, actually. So it goes through the opening. The left side, it pierces the muscle of the diaphragm, because they supply the diaphragm from the inferior surface. Do not forget this. Supply the diaphragm from its inferior surface by giving anterior, lateral, and posterior branches to cover the area of the diaphragm from below. And this we studied with the diaphragm, the nerve supply of the diaphragm. Okay, the last structure you'll find is the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct begins as an extension of what's so-called the cisterna chyli. Cisterna chyli on the lumbar vertebrae, the upper two lumbar vertebrae, the cisterna chyli, behind or beside the celiac trunk that we'll study in the abdomen. It goes through the aortic opening. It enters the thorax between the aorta on its left and azygos on its right, okay, and ascends on the left side, posterior to arch of aorta, between the esophagus and the mediastinal pleura, and then enters the root of the neck, remember this, and curves laterally, slightly laterally to open at the junction of the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein. On its way, it takes, remember, the three main trunks: one for the head and neck, which is the jugular trunk; one for the upper limb, which is the subclavian trunk; and one for the corresponding hemothorax, which is the bronchomediastinal trunk. And then it opens into the junction of the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein. Now it drains all the body except the upper right fourth, which is the right upper limb, okay, and the corresponding half of the head and neck that form the three trunks we talked about. But eventually these trunks join and open into the junction of the right internal jugular vein and the right subclavian vein. Okay, so this is all what we have to say about the superior mediastinum. In some books you will find that they describe each structure, and each structure with its relations. It's actually it's very confusing when you study the relations of individual structures. Pick one structure. I pick always the pulmonary trunk and study the relations around the pulmonary trunk, or study the relations around the ascending thoracic artery or the arch of the aorta, and then you will be able to figure out the relations of each one. You know what I mean. Okay, I hope you got this the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.